In every major disaster, there's usually a single element that turns a bad situation into a catastrophe. At sea, it might be a watertight door left open. In the mountains, it might be a sudden storm or a wrong turn on a ridge. On railways, it's often fire. Because trains are long, narrow steel tubes where the only exits are the doors you can reach before the smoke reaches you. Engineers have a phrase for the combination of heat, smoke, limited oxygen, and no escape: a fire corridor. It's not an official technical term, but it is the one firefighters and investigators kept coming back to after the events of this case. Imagine a tunnel several hundred meters long, a heavy passenger train, sealed for winter, pushing deep into it. Fuel, plastics, and luggage all around. One spark is all it takes. The line where this happened wound through a little-known mountain range somewhere in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. It connected a capital city to a string of mining towns and small villages nestled in valleys and along a narrow river gorge. For most of its existence, the route was considered safe but old-fashioned. Steep grades, a single track for long sections, and a series of tunnels carved into rock decades earlier, when safety standards were very different from today's. Local people had their own stories about the line. They talked about icy tracks in winter, about rockfalls after heavy rain, and about how the railway company seemed to care more about keeping the timetable than fixing the infrastructure. But none of that ever made national news. Small accidents happened in remote places, and unless a high-profile politician was on board, they rarely reached the front page. That changed on one particular night train. It had a name, like many overnight services do, but in the reports that followed, investigators and journalists referred to it in a more chilling way. They called it simply, "the train that vanished in flames." The phrase sounds dramatic, even exaggerated, until you look at what was left and what wasn't. By the time the fire was out and the surviving cars were hauled back to daylight, several coaches were burned far beyond recognition. A few were twisted into the kind of shapes you only see in high-speed crashes, and at least 2 cars that had been listed on the manifest were never conclusively identified. Some officials quietly suggested they had fallen into the river gorge below. Others, just as quietly, claimed those cars had never been properly documented to begin with. The reality is that what happened that night is a combination of human error, structural negligence, and bad luck in the worst possible place. And the first warning signs came long before the fire was ever visible. The train left the capital in the early evening, a diesel locomotive at the front, followed by a baggage car. 3 standard-seated coaches, 2 sleeper cars, a dining car, and at the very back, a special cargo coach that most passengers never even noticed. On paper, it was just another night run. In practice, it was already overloaded with risk. The railway company had been under increasing pressure that year. Passenger numbers were down, freight contracts were up, and the aging fleet was being pushed to do more with less maintenance. In internal memos that only came to light years later, engineers warned about dated electrical systems, faulty circuit breakers, and fuel lines that ran dangerously close to hot surfaces under heavy load. None of that ever made it to the public timetable. Then there was the cargo coach. Officially, it carried general goods destined for the mountain towns, machinery parts, spare tools, and sealed drums of industrial solvents. But those solvents, as survivors and later tests would reveal, were highly flammable. They were supposed to be transported under strict conditions, with limited quantities per wagon and clear separation from passenger cars. Instead, they were loaded hastily near the back of a passenger train, just a few couplings away from people sleeping in their berths. Inside the passenger coaches, the atmosphere was exactly what you'd expect from an overnight train on a workday. Families settling children into seats that wouldn't recline quite far enough. Students crowding into compartments, sharing snacks and horror stories about upcoming exams. A few business travelers trying to read reports by dim overhead lights before giving up and closing their eyes to the rhythm of the tracks. The crew knew the route well. The driver had been running trains along the line for more than a decade. The conductor could name every small station by the sound of the platform underfoot. They also knew about the tunnels, including one in particular, a long, slightly curved bore carved into the mountain at the deepest point of the gorge. On the diagrams it had a number. Among railway workers, it had a nickname, the Throat, because once a train entered, It felt like being swallowed by the mountain. Normally, a train would slow slightly before entering this tunnel, if only out of habit and respect for the grade. On this night, though, dispatchers had instructed the crew to make up a few minutes of delay. A late freight train, a track inspection, and a minor signal failure near the capital had already put them behind schedule. In isolation, this wasn't unusual. But on a steep section with old rails and questionable maintenance, it added just one more layer of pressure. Several witnesses later recalled that the train felt restless that night. Not in any supernatural sense, just in the way the cars shuddered more than usual. The lights flickered slightly on curves, and the smell of diesel seemed sharper than normal when the doors opened at intermediate stops. One passenger, a retired mechanic, even mentioned to a steward that he thought he smelled something electrical. Overheating near one of the coaches. He was reassured, politely but firmly, that everything was fine. The truth is that by the time the train reached the foothills and began its long climb into the mountains, several small problems were already in motion. Worn components in the locomotive's electrical system, a slightly loose connection in the cargo coach, and a line of communication between dispatch and the crew that emphasized punctuality over caution. Individually, none of these would have guaranteed disaster. Together, they created the conditions for what was about to happen. As the last town slipped by and the lights of civilization thinned out into scattered farmhouses, the night outside grew darker and colder. Passengers who weren't already asleep pulled up blankets and closed their curtains, watching their reflections in the glass merge with the silhouettes of pine trees racing past. Somewhere far ahead, the dark mouth of the tunnel waited, invisible around a bend. Inside the train, nobody knew that once they crossed that point, their options for survival would shrink to almost nothing. Shortly after 11:30 p.m., the train began the steepest climb of the route. The engine throttled up, the vibrations deepened, and the coaches creaked in a way that regular travelers recognized as the start of the mountain section. Many people, lulled by the steady motion, finally drifted off. A few night owls remained awake. A student revising under the weak light of a compartment lamp, a mother walking a crying toddler up and down the corridor, a couple in the dining car finishing lukewarm coffee as the staff prepared to close for the night. In the locomotive, the driver monitored the gauges with one eye on the darkness ahead. He had driven this exact section hundreds of times. He knew where the rail joints were rough, where the wind sometimes pushed sideways against the cars, and where avalanches had once blocked the track in particularly bad winters. What he could not see, and what maintenance logs later revealed, was that a section of the electrical harness feeding the rear coaches had been rubbing against a sharp edge of metal every time the train leaned into a certain curve. Over thousands of kilometers, the insulation had worn thinner and thinner. As the train leaned into that familiar curve that night, the harness flexed one more time. The insulation finally failed. A small arc of electricity jumped to the metal surface nearby just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. In the baggage area of the rearmost passenger coach, a few cardboard boxes had been stacked by the crew earlier in the evening, packages that hadn't fit neatly in the cargo car during the rushed loading process. Some contained clothes, others paper records, and one held rags soaked in oil from a workshop, poorly wrapped in plastic. The Ark found them. Fire investigators later tried to reconstruct the exact timing. Based on burn patterns and char depth, they concluded that a small fire probably smoldered unnoticed for several minutes, feeding on cardboard, cloth, and whatever else was nearby. At first, there would have been little smoke, just heat building in a confined space. Then, as more material caught, the flames would have started to flicker higher, licking at plastic wall panels and luggage above. Passengers there did notice something, but they didn't agree on what. Some recalled a faint chemical smell, like warm plastic or paint. Others remembered a low cracking sound from the floor, as if a crate had shifted. A few thought they saw a thin haze of smoke near the ceiling of the corridor, but assumed it was from someone smoking in the vestibule between the cars. Most people did what humans usually do in ambiguous situations. They rationalized and tried not to make a scene. The first person to fully understand that something was wrong wasn't a passenger at all, but a steward walking through the car to check tickets. He opened the door to the small baggage nook, saw a glow and sudden rush of hot air, and immediately slammed it shut. Training told him to raise the alarm. Instinct told him to try to handle it quickly so as not to panic everyone. He grabbed the nearest portable extinguisher and pulled the pin. By this point, the train was already approaching the entrance to the throat, the long tunnel that bore through the side of the mountain. The driver had just received a radio message from dispatch. A freight train was running late behind them, so if they could maintain speed through the tunnel, the night's schedule could still recover. There was no indication on his panel that anything was wrong in the rear coaches. Back in the baggage area, the steward tried to aim the extinguisher at the base of the flames, but the heat and smoke hit him in the face like a physical blow. Plastic fittings were already dripping from the ceiling. The fire had climbed into a narrow cavity and was racing along cables toward the next compartment. The extinguisher slowed it briefly, leaving white residue on charred surfaces, but it did not reach the now hidden core of the blaze. Crucially, no one yet had pulled the emergency brake. On older trains, passengers often had direct access to a red handle that would stop the train in an emergency. On this train, newer regulations meant the brake could be overridden from the cab to prevent false alarms in tunnels and on bridges. It was designed to keep people safe from poorly timed stops. That night, it would trap them instead. As the locomotive nose passed into the tunnel mouth, the world outside the windows went from forest shapes to absolute blackness. Passengers felt the subtle change in sound as the train entered the enclosed rock. The rumble became louder, the air pressure shifted, and reflections from inside the coach floated in the glass like ghosts. Inside the burning baggage compartment, the fire suddenly found all the oxygen it needed. The slight vacuum created by the train's movement through the tunnel pulled fresh air through every gap and opening. Flames leapt forward. Within seconds, smoke began to pour into the corridor. Someone screamed. Someone else started pounding on cabin doors, shouting "Fire!" in a dozen different voices and accents. Far ahead, the driver's radio crackled with a frantic voice. A crew member in the middle coaches, trying to explain through coughs that there was a serious fire spreading backward. The driver's hand moved instinctively toward the throttle, but the laws of physics and momentum had already taken over. He was now driving a heavy, burning train into a rock tunnel at speed, with nowhere for the smoke to go but forward and nowhere for the people to go but back. When a fire breaks out in an open field, heat goes upward and smoke disperses into the sky. When it breaks out inside a moving train in a tunnel, that smoke forms a choking, horizontal river of toxic gas, traveling at the same speed as the people trying to escape it. Witnesses who survived described it in almost the same way. One moment, you could see the corridor ahead. The next, it was like someone had poured ink into the air. The driver did what little he could. He cut power, applied the brakes, and radioed an emergency call to the nearest signal box, shouting that there was a fire and they needed power cut to the tunnel immediately. The signalman, alone in a small outpost miles away, hit the emergency switches and began calling rescue services. But even if the power went off instantly, the train's momentum would carry it deep into the mountain before it stopped. Inside, chaos unfolded in waves. In the front coaches, people smelled smoke and saw it filtering under doors, but still had some visibility. They were able to move toward the vestibules, open windows, and gather by the exits. In the central coaches, the situation was worse. Thick smoke poured through ceiling panels and ventilation ducts, making every breath painful. Children cried, some passengers froze in their seats, and others tried to push through the aisles. In the rear cars, closest to the source of the fire, the situation became unsurvivable within minutes. Windows cracked under the heat. Plastic interiors melted. Those who tried to move forward found the corridor already full of flame and rolling smoke. Many never made it out of those compartments. When the train finally screeched to a halt, it did so not at the tunnel entrance, but deep inside, roughly 2/3 of the way through. The locomotive and first few cars ended up in a slightly wider area where an emergency niche had been carved into the rock, a design feature meant to give maintenance workers space to stand. The rear cars, however, remained on a curve over a narrow part of the gorge, where the tunnel walls were thinner and the bedrock weaker. Rescue workers arriving at the tunnel portals faced an almost impossible task. From one side, they could see the faint glow of fire and hear muffled screams and banging on metal. From the other, dense smoke billowed out, making entry without breathing equipment suicidal. Local volunteer firefighters arrived first, with limited gear and no clear idea of how long the train was, or exactly where in the tunnel it was stopped. Early radio communication between the crew and dispatch was later described as fragmented and contradictory. One message suggested the fire was under control in a rear baggage area. Another, minutes later, screamed that an entire coach was on fire. Somewhere in the confusion, both portals received slightly different information about which end of the train the worst damage was on. Rescue teams split. Some went in from the east, some from the west, each convinced the other side had the clearer route. Visibility inside quickly dropped to near zero. Firefighters felt their way along the walls, guided by the occasional burst of flame or the sound of coughing. They extracted people from the forward cars first, those who could still walk or be dragged to safety. Further back, they encountered doors fused shut by heat, corridors blocked by collapsed panels, and makeshift barricades of luggage that desperate passengers had tried to use to keep smoke out. At some point, during those first chaotic minutes, something happened to the rear of the train that would later fuel rumors and conspiracy theories. Survivors in the front cars spoke of feeling a violent jolt, as if the train had been struck from behind. Others remembered a deep, grinding sound followed by a sensation of movement under their feet, like a slow, lurching pull. Then, a loud metallic crack echoed through the tunnel. Investigators later concluded that the heat had reached a critical point near the coupling between the last passenger coach and the cargo car. The metal had been weakened, and the track beneath was already under stress from years of rock pressure. In the combination of intense heat, expanding air, and water being sprayed by firefighters from one portal, the rock around a small section of the tunnel fractured. The last car, the one with the drums of solvent, and possibly one of the adjacent coaches, derailed on the curve. Railway engineers reconstructing the scene believed that those rear cars were dragged partially off the track and into the side of the tunnel, where the rock gave way to the empty space of the gorge beyond. In plain language, a burning car, filled with fuel and human beings, fell out of the tunnel wall and into the black void below. It happened in the worst possible location, where the tracks were perched over a steep drop that daylight rarely touched. Search teams scoured the gorge for days afterward, lowering themselves on ropes, shining searchlights into the river, and walking kilometers along the rocky banks. They found twisted metal, fragments of luggage, and, in some places, unrecognizable human remains. What they didn't find was anything that could clearly be identified as an intact passenger coach. Currents in the river were strong, the water level had been high that week, and landslides from the heat-weakened rock kept burying debris. Officially, the records list a certain number of cars and a certain number of confirmed dead and missing. Unofficially, even the people who were there admit that they were not entirely sure how many people the train realistically carried that night. Tickets were sometimes bought on board. Children, especially in remote regions, were often unregistered. And in the confusion of evacuation, some of the severely burned victims were never definitively identified. By the time the fire was finally brought under control and the surviving sections of the train were hauled back toward the portal, the scene looked less like a technical failure and more like a war zone. Windows were blown out. The paint was gone, replaced by blistered metal. The smell of burned plastic, diesel, and something all the rescuers recognized as human hung in the air long after the last casualty was removed. The press, blocked at road checkpoints further down the valley, received only snippets of information for the first 24 hours. A fire in a tunnel, a serious incident. Multiple casualties. By the time the first grainy photographs appeared in national newspapers, the phrase that would define the disaster had already been whispered on local radio. This was the night the train vanished in flames. In the weeks that followed, 3 different investigations began almost simultaneously. The railway company launched an internal inquiry, focused on equipment, crew actions, and whether anyone violated operating procedures. The government formed a formal commission, promising transparency and full access to records. And quietly, behind closed doors, the state security services opened their own file. worried that this might have been sabotage rather than negligence. From the start, the investigators faced problems that could never be fully solved. Key physical evidence had been destroyed by fire or buried in the gorge below the tunnel. Survivor testimony was fragmented, shaped by trauma, smoke inhalation, and incomplete memories. Official logs didn't always match what dispatchers and crew members recalled over coffee in the days afterward. Still, some facts were impossible to ignore. Electrical experts identified clear signs of arcing in the remains of the harness near the rear coaches. Material scientists showed that the plastic wall panels used in the refurbished car interiors produced dense, toxic smoke when burned, smoke that could incapacitate a healthy adult in minutes. Transport safety specialists pointed out that the placement of highly flammable industrial solvents in a coach so close to passengers violated even the relaxed standards of the time. In their early drafts, the Government Commission's report used strong language. It spoke of systemic negligence, regulatory capture, and a pattern of cost-cutting that prioritized punctuality over passenger safety. Several senior managers at the railway company were named directly, with the implication that criminal charges might follow. Then, slowly, the wording began to soften. By the time the final report was released to the public months later, phrases like systemic negligence had been replaced with unfortunate oversights. Specific names had been removed, replaced by generic references to management decisions and legacy infrastructure. The cargo manifest, which had explicitly listed flammable solvents and other dangerous materials, was now described as mixed goods. The internal company report remained classified, but parts of it leaked to the press. It mentioned something the official report did not: a confidential memo from engineers written a year before the disaster, warning that a particular batch of refurbished coaches used wiring that could chafe against metal supports if not installed with extra protective sleeves. Those sleeves were expensive and time-consuming to add. The order to install them on certain cars had been deferred until the next budget cycle. And there were the missing cars. On paper, the trains consist, the exact sequence of locomotives and wagons was clear. Yet when journalists compared early witness statements with later official diagrams, they found small discrepancies. Some survivors insisted there had been an additional baggage coach near the rear. Others spoke of a second cargo car that they had seen being loaded in the capital. The official records, after several revisions, acknowledged only one cargo wagon. When pressed about this, railway officials blamed confusion and the chaos of the night. They argued that people misremembered what they'd seen in the dark on the platform and that mixing freight and passenger cars was common practice. But the unease remained. If manifest documents could be adjusted after the fact, what else about the official story might have been quietly edited? The sabotage theory, attractive to those looking for a single villain, never gained solid evidence. No credible explosive residues were found. No anonymous claims of responsibility appeared. Security services eventually conceded that, while sabotage couldn't be ruled out with absolute certainty, the most likely cause was a tragic chain of technical failures and human decisions that left no one person entirely to blame, and no one entirely innocent either. For the families of the victims, none of this mattered as much as the day-to-day reality of life afterward. Some had lost multiple relatives who had been traveling together: parents and children, siblings, couples. Others had loved ones listed as missing, presumed dead, with no body ever recovered from the gorge. Compensation payments were slow and often meager. Public memorials were promised, then delayed, then quietly unveiled with little ceremony years later. On the anniversary of the disaster, local villagers still gather near the closed tunnel portal. The line through the gorge was eventually shut down and rerouted by a safer, longer path. The tunnel itself was sealed, a heavy steel door welded across the entrance, with only a small plaque and some fading flowers to indicate what had happened inside. Official speeches talk about lessons learned and improved safety. But among the people who live in the valley, the story is told in a different way. They talk about the night when the mountain glowed from within, when the sky above the gorge turned orange, and when screams could be heard from a hole in the rock for what felt like hours. They talk about how some bodies were never found, and how sometimes, on quiet nights, The older residents swear they can still smell smoke when the wind comes down from the pass. Whether you believe the more supernatural versions of those stories or not, one thing is certain: this was not just a random accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system that treated warning signs as inconveniences, that trusted old tunnels to behave like new ones, and that stored flammable cargo a few meters away from sleeping families because it was good enough for now. In the end, the official record calls it a tunnel fire, an incident involving multiple fatalities. Locals and survivors call it something else. The night the train vanished in flames, and with it, any illusion that the journey home is always as safe as we like to believe.